Welcome to episode 40 of the World Builder's Anvil. Once again, I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram, and today's topic, types of governments in fantasy world building. Don't know where to start building your fantasy world? Do you need more? Does it make sense? Forget any worries and become a crafter of imagination. This is the place that will help prime your mind. Now, it's time to heat up the forge, break out the mithril ingots and hammer. Welcome to the World Builder's Anvil. I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram. Let's sup from the mug of Java and build. Welcome back again, and let's get right into today's topic. I think too often when people are building fantasy states, they think about these labels, especially these Western labels of, is my state a democracy, or is it communism, or is it a monarchy? But they think about them in a very sort of modern context of today. And so what I'm going to suggest is thinking a little bit more in depth about your governments and coming up with a name that fits culturally appropriate to the state that it is. First off, how much power is in the state? Is it an anarchy? And by that, I don't mean the modern definition of state with no government, but there is no central authority, at least none that is recognized by the people who live there. There could be judicial systems. There could be other things set up. It's from the bottom up. I don't think many states will actually be anarchy states. They might sort of resemble what you would think of as one, especially if a state collapses and the vacuum isn't filled up right away, and you have a bunch of warring parties within it. You might think that's anarchy. That's really just a collapsed state, and anarchy might or might not look the same, but when I speak of anarchy, I'm talking about more of the philosophical term of anarchy, essentially an area with no central authority that it reports to, a true democracy. This is something that we don't know today. It's probably also not going to be commonly used once the population of an area grows too much. Essentially, there's no executive authority in a true democracy. Everything's voted on. Do we go to war? Do we need a law for this? Do we need a law for that? They are all voted upon by all of the people who are eligible to vote within the society. So, for example, in early Athens, you might vote on whether or not to go to war. However, only Athenian citizens were allowed to vote in that. So there were other people who were in the society who weren't considered an Athenian citizen. Even if they lived in Athens, they weren't eligible to vote. So true democracies might still have limitations, but they'll be more along the lines of a true citizen or something like that. Or sort of closely related to that is our modern idea of democracy, which is consent of the governed. And this is a term that you hear used a lot, and it's supposed to insinuate that the people have some hand in the process of electing their leaders, and ergo whoever their leaders are or their rulers are have the consent of the people to rule. A modern day democracy, a democratic republic, a republic, these are all various forms of that. Limited monarchy. Monarchy is another term that I don't like the definition people think of today. When I think of monarchy, I do not think of kings. What I think of is executive power. And when I say limited monarchy, what I'm talking about is there are things within the either legal system or in the culture itself that prevents them from having absolute authority. However, the executive pretty much controls the state. And it could even be a small group of people, like maybe 3, but it's really pushing down towards executive authority over democratic authority. And finally, authoritarian. This is your total control state. These are your Orwellian dystopias. Much like anarchy, you will probably almost never see one of these until the ability is gained by the power to influence that kind of control. Another thing you need to think about are how do your rulers come to power? Is it a birthright? I am Lord because my father was Lord. Personal traits. Maybe the culture that created the state or the cultures that created the state have a great affinity towards intellect. So only the smart people become rulers. And there's some test on whether or not you are eligible for nobility or being a governor. And it might not even be just that. Maybe it's blue eyes. Maybe it's a certain ethnicity. Maybe it's physical strength. It can be really anything, but it's this idea that personal traits of individuals give them the ability to govern. And only individuals with those traits can be in the governing class. Appointed by a divine source. Whether true or fictional, this is sort of a common theme throughout history, where you have emperors and kings who have said that either the heavens or gods in heavens have granted them the authority to reign over the land. This is a popular one if you want to centralize authority in the executive branch, because what it really says is, if you disagree with the leader, you are actually in defiance of the god/gods or the heavens or whatever supernatural force empowered him. Now, it would be a double whammy if he actually was. So if you have a world where gods directly interact with the people, well, you're in huge trouble. Perhaps they're appointed by the previous leader. And this is something that has been experimented with in the past. The Romans did this, even though the leaders appointed were typically their children. However, not always. And whether or not it works is a different question. However, I am Emperor Ingram, and I appoint Emperor Frost to succeed me when I die. And I say that in hope I still live more than a few hours. Even though the Frost, I know, probably wouldn't off me quite so quickly. She's a much nicer person than other people who are going to be emperor. A coup. This happens quite a bit throughout history, even today. Coups happen all the time. A coup is essentially when military force is used by people internally to exit the current ruler. AKA goodbye Caligula, goodbye Nero, goodbye many third world countries, and I'm sure in the first world, if people thought they could get away with it, they would still be doing it. Random selection. This is an interesting one, and this is not unheard of, where people are randomly selected, perhaps via a lottery, to become a ruler. And maybe it's for a limited period of time, maybe it's for life, who knows, but there's essentially a lottery system that draws from a pool of eligible rulers, and they are randomly selected. Elections. Don't think it's just about democracy. You might have a small, powerful ruling elite, a nobility. They might elect who the king or emperor is. I believe the Holy Roman Empire did this. I believe the old Germanic tribes did this. When you talk about old republic, a lot of times people would vote on the leader. But once the leader was elected, he was inherently the king or emperor or the chief executive in charge of everything. Even though they were definitely, back then in a much more limited way, because you can only truly can have absolute power if you can truly step into and interfere in all aspects of people's lives. Now, how are the transitions of power handled? They could be peaceful. And the United States is renowned for this, I think. Most of Western Europe, many places, I don't know of any violence in Chinese handovers of power. And it's not necessarily even about the freedom. It's about when the next ruler is put into place, what are the reaction of the people? It could potentially turn violent. That's another option. And this could be riots or people protesting the streets, strikes, other types of things where the people can show their displeasure, with the new ruler, and will involve some form of violence. Civil war. This is an unfortunate one that has come up quite a bit, where people don't like the transition, and so different powerful groups within the country start building up armies, and they start fighting against each other. They all come up with what they call claims to rule or to be free or whatever the claims are, but they start fighting an actual war over the succession. Countries where this happens typically have huge economical issues going forward. War leads to inflation because goods and services are used to help the war machine, and they become more scarce for the people who live within the country. So if you have a war even external, it can cause inflation to a varying degree within a country. If you have a civil war, you have both sides trying to eat up all of the resources possible to make sure that their side wins. The people who aren't necessarily involved get help foot the bill via inflation. Another one I like to look at are how are rights earned. And there might be little or no rights. And there's actually, I'm noticing one I didn't put down here, which is you have rights because they can't stop you from doing it. And that's really a right too, where a ruler has rights that he gives out to people. But if he says you can't dance in the town, but he has no way of preventing you from doing it, and you do it, that's really a right because he can't prevent it. However, rights earned that way are often dangerous. The state typically does not like to be told no. They, I think, fear that it will hurt their authority. I can't speak for all the states that have cracked down. But now back to my list. 1, natural rights. Inherently, because of your existence, you have rights. In the United States, we have several. They're supposedly natural rights. And some people will say they're from God or from the humanity, or it doesn't matter where they come from. It's the belief in the cultures being ruled in the state that they have the right because they are. Now, the rights granted by rulers. I have 3 listed down here, but there are definitely, this part could be much more comprehensive if I wanted to spend time here. But nepotism, family, friends, you get positions and power. Ta-da! Hope he doesn't lose. Forced by the mob. This happens throughout history. A lot of times people give way too much credit to the authority of kings and emperors and think that they can do whatever they want to because they're kings and emperors. But a lot of times they can't. They need usually the support of the nobility to keep the people of the country in place. Or they need the people in the country to keep the nobles in place. And when you start relying too heavily on one or the other one in a strong executive forum, you actually start weakening your rulership. So a lot of times rulers will kind of go back and forth on, I'm with the mob here, I'm with the rulers here. It's sort of a dangerous game, but I think, especially in ancient or medieval times, being a ruler was dangerous. Reward, perhaps it's for skill, perhaps it's for loyalty, whatever the reason. Perhaps the ruler gives you land for serving in his military, much like Rome did, in theory, when they would retire their legions because they became too old. The veterans of the legion would either be put into new legions, or if they had served enough years, later on in the empire, they would be given land. Or really later on in the Republic of Rome, they'd be given land. And this didn't always happen, and that would lead to some interesting conflict when the person who retired you didn't have the land to give you, or didn't want to give it to you. Who owns what? This is the idea of property rights. And people will think capitalism, communism, it's more complicated than that, so I don't list it as such here. Really, it's the idea of, do the individuals own the property they have, or does the state, or is it somewhere in between? Now, in medieval Europe, especially in early medieval Europe, the peasants didn't own the land. They rented the land from the Lord, either through labor or money, however they got the land. They had the land given to them from the Lord. So, in that kind of scenario, it's state control. Now, and feudalism is really fractured amongst many smaller leaders to help manage the land, or it's still owned by the state. A lot of times, especially in later medieval times, the king would continuously grant the right of certain nobles to control certain lands. However, the titles would end up falling more in the power of the executive branch. And if you displeased the king, in theory, he could take your title from you. Whether he actually had the power to do that was a different thing. Is the state tied to a religion? Now, I don't think of a theocracy as a form of government, and it's considered one, but to me, is there a state religion? Are the heads of the state religious figures? It doesn't matter what form of government or what it's called. If the religion controls the state, i.e., if you're a heretic, you are illegal, or if you sin, you have broken the law, and there will always be some crossover, but when it's 100% lined up with the religion, then the state and the religion are completely tied together. Whether or not the rulers of the state are actually the people who directly control the religion. And then within there, you can figure out if it's separate, sort of like in medieval Europe, where you have the Pope in Rome and you have all of these Catholic rulers around, you can have a dynamic that way. Or, if you go to a theocracy where the supreme leader of the land is a religious figure, or even, technically, no, that's not true. I'll take that away. I don't think the Byzantines were that, because I don't think the emperor was the head of the church, but he might have been the head of, he was probably the self-proclaimed head of the church, I'm sure, much like the pontiff in Rome was. What do you call the state? Now, I'm going to include a link here to, I think it's Rational Wiki, which had a pretty extensive, interesting list of types of governments. However, my suggestion is, if you want to explain it to people, use terms like you'll find there, but realize usually people don't call themselves the Kingdom of England. They have a name for the kingdom, and in English it's called kingdom, but it's not going to be called that in other places. And usually when you think of a kingdom, you think of like one major ethnicity dominating. You think of empire, you think of multiple kingdoms being controlled. So multiple ethnic kingdoms under the control of one person's banner. Or it can be smaller or larger. If you want to use those names, I think it's fine. If you want to come up with a cultural name or consider too that usually before nation states evolve in your world, it might just be the dynasty. So it could be the Nortons. This is the Nortons. And you'll see that throughout history where the name of the leaders, the family name becomes the name of the kingdom. And now I want to add in a special little bonus where I want to start thanking the people that have reviewed me. And I want to thank Nick at 5 Minutes with Dad for his wonderful review for my show. And I'm going to start doing this every week because I always ask people to please subscribe, rate, and review to my show. I don't know who subscribes, but I do know who, if they rate and review, if they do both of those tasks in iTunes where they fill out the stars and they write a small blurb saying what they like about the show, what they think would be better, or what they think should be worse. I don't know if people could say that. It's up to them. It's their review. But if they do that, I'll thank them here. And I'm going to start thinking maybe a couple a week. I don't know how many. But I'm going to start thanking people because I think I owe it to people who've taken that time because it helps me out, and I hope it helps out other people find me. The rating for this episode, this is a basic topic. You need to know in your world what types of governments they are and try to get beyond thinking what you're taught in civics class. Because a democracy doesn't need to be free. A monarchy doesn't need to be authoritarian. Anarchy doesn't need to be bad. Authoritarianism doesn't necessarily need to be bad. And none of them need to be good either. So try and get beyond your personal biases that you've learned in class and get past the names that you're used to hearing and think what really is the structure of the government. The world building task for the day, take a state in your world and define the government it has. It's that simple. The real world task for the day. If you have kids, please go check out, rate, and review Nick's podcast. And since I know Nick, I know he has 2 podcasts. I'm going to link them here. One's called 5 Minutes with Dad, and it's essentially him with his young children doing a short show, and then he puts a little commentary when they're not around to help flesh it out. And Confessions of a Terrible Husband, which is a great podcast, which actually, as I've mentioned before, has helped inspire the real world task of the day here. But it's about not forgetting the people around you. The tease for the next episode is Tax Attack. And as always, make sure to go to gardul.com. That's GARDUL.com for the show notes. It'll be under Podcasting, World Builders Anvil. That's a great place to get all of the information from the episode that you've just listened to and to see all the resources that we've talked about in this episode. Thanks for joining us this episode of the World Builders Anvil. Please be sure to rate and review us in iTunes, and please help get the word out to your friends about our show. And join me, Jeffrey W. Ingram at Gardul.com, to see the progress of my world and learn why I made the choices I did. And please contact me and let me know the topics you would love to hear in the future. Now strike, while the myth rolls high.